They called it God's justice. But William Wallace's execution on August 23, 1305, was anything but divine. The truth behind medieval England's most infamous punishment exposes a system built to break not only bodies, but spirits. From the measured drop of the noose to the public display of mutilated remains, every stage was designed as a warning, an act of state power that turned suffering into a spectacle. This was no simple end for a rebel knight. It was a calculated effort to erase the man and the symbol he had become. To understand why such extremes were used, we have to look at the fractured world that produced them. The political landscape of Scotland in 1305 was volatile, shaped by years of unresolved succession and mounting English interference. After King Alexander III died, without a clear heir, Scotland's nobles invited Edward I of England to mediate the dispute. What began as a plea for arbitration quickly turned into domination. Edward installed John Balliol as king in 1292, but Balliol's authority was hollow. Edward demanded fealty, summoned him repeatedly to English courts, and made it clear that Scotland was to be treated as a vassal state. English garrisons took control of strategic castles, and symbols of Scottish identity, like the Stone of Scone, were removed to England. These actions stoked a deep resentment among Scots, creating the conditions for resistance that William Wallace would later harness. Edward's occupation policies were harsh and calculated. English troops spread across Scottish strongholds, enforcing new taxes and confiscating lands from families suspected of disloyalty. The Scottish nobility, faced with overwhelming force and the threat of ruin, largely submitted. Many signed the ragman rolls, swearing loyalty to Edward in hopes of preserving their status and property. This accommodation, however, came at a cost. It left the nobility compromised and the general population disillusioned, their leaders now seen as collaborators rather than defenders of Scottish independence. Amid this climate, Wallace's refusal to submit stood out. Unlike most nobles, he never swore allegiance to Edward. At his trial, English prosecutors accused him of falsely calling himself King of Scotland, a claim that reflected not just his leadership in battle, but the symbolic threat he posed to English authority. For Edward, Wallace was more than a rebel. He was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of English rule, and this made the campaign against him especially ruthless. The Scottish nobility's internal rivalries only deepened the crisis. Figures like Robert the Bruce and John Comyn, both with claims to the throne, spent as much energy maneuvering against each other as they did resisting the English. Their shifting allegiances and personal ambitions created instability, leaving the broader resistance fragmented. Wallace, by contrast, operated outside these circles of compromise. His outsider status and single-minded opposition to English control gave him a unique appeal among ordinary Scots, but it also made him a target for betrayal. Edward understood that as long as Wallace remained at large, English dominance in Scotland would never be secure. The English king responded with increasing severity, destroying villages suspected of sheltering rebels, dispatching spies, and raising bounties for Wallace's capture. These tactics gradually eroded Wallace's support network, making trust a rare commodity. Even so, Wallace continued to evade capture, relying on the loyalty of those who still believed in the cause. By the summer of 1305, the pressure had reached a breaking point. Edward's strategy of isolation, combined with the lure of reward and the threat of reprisal, turned former allies into informants. The machinery of occupation and betrayal tightened its grip, setting the stage for the decisive moment when Wallace would finally be brought down, not by the English alone, but through the actions of those once counted as his own. For years, Wallace slipped through the grasp of his enemies, using Scotland's wild terrain to his advantage. He relied on the dense cover of the Highlands and the tangled woods of Ettrick Forest, where his knowledge of hidden paths and fords allowed him to strike quickly and disappear just as fast. This landscape, coupled with a network of villagers willing to risk everything to shelter him, turned Wallace into a figure of myth as much as a man. The people who aided him did so out of more than fear or obligation. It was a silent, widespread act of resistance against English rule. Edward I, determined to end this defiance, built a system designed to break Wallace's support. He dispatched spies in the guise of travelers and merchants, and offered rewards that grew more tempting each year. The English administration paid informants to spread rumors and cast doubts, hoping to fracture the unity that had kept Wallace hidden. As suspicion grew and the threat of collective punishment intensified, fewer dared to offer him shelter. The promise of land, silver, or mere survival began to outweigh loyalty. The decisive betrayal came at Robroyston, near Glasgow. Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight already in Edward's service, arranged for Wallace to stay with him. Some say Menteith acted out of ambition, seeking English favor and reward. Others argue he saw no future in continued resistance and chose what he believed was the least destructive path for himself and his lands. Whatever the reasoning, the outcome was the same. While Wallace slept, Menteith's men moved in. There was no warning, no chance for escape. Wallace was seized, bound, and delivered to English soldiers waiting nearby. Planning for the arrest had taken weeks. Menteith's cooperation ensured that Wallace was captured alive, a detail that mattered greatly to Edward. The English king wanted a living symbol of rebellion to parade before the world, proof that even Scotland's most defiant leader could be subdued. Menteith received his reward, lands, and perhaps a position, but his name became synonymous with treachery in Scotland. He gained little lasting trust from the English, either. The betrayal was a warning to others, a demonstration of how occupation could twist allegiances and force impossible choices. Today, a granite cross stands at Robryston, marking the place where Wallace's freedom ended. Its inscription, "I tell you true, freedom is the best of things. Never lie within the bonds of slavery, my son," echoes the ideals Wallace fought for, set starkly against the reality of his capture. The monument's presence is a reminder that betrayal often comes not from distant enemies, but from those who once shared a cause. The capture of Wallace exposed the corrosive effects of occupation. Edward's use of informants and bounties turned communities inward, making fear and suspicion more powerful than loyalty. The act of betrayal did succeed in removing Wallace from the struggle, but it also set in motion the transformation of a man into a legend. Stories of his capture and the price paid for his head spread quickly, fueling anger rather than submission. Menteith's name faded into infamy, a footnote in the larger story of resistance. After Robryston, the English held their prize. Wallace, once a symbol of hope in the forests and glens, now faced a different kind of ordeal, one designed not just to end his life, but to erase his legacy. What followed was not a simple transfer to the capital, but a calculated public ordeal. Wallace's captors chained him in iron manacles that forced him to walk hunched, the restraints biting into his wrists and ankles. The journey south covered more than 400 miles, each stop chosen to maximize his exposure to the English public. In every town along the route, guards paraded him before crowds who jeered, spat, and hurled refuse. The English wanted their people, farmers, merchants, children, to see the man who had defied their king reduced to a captive, stripped of all dignity. The procession advanced along established military roads, Wallace trailing behind horses, breathing in dust and enduring the blows of his guards. At night, he was locked in local jails or castle dungeons, always under watch. Sleep was scarce. Some accounts mention guards waking him with kicks or cold water, ensuring exhaustion wore him down. This was no mere transport. It was the opening act of his punishment, meant to erode his resolve before he ever reached London. Officials turned the journey into a spectacle. In major towns like York and Nottingham, they staged formal displays, presenting Wallace as a living warning. Local priests sometimes lectured on the consequences of rebellion, using Wallace's chained silence as a visual aid. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would lead to public disgrace. Children brought to witness the spectacle would remember the lesson for years to come. Approaching London, the humiliation intensified. At St. Albans, not far from the city, guards mocked Wallace by placing a crown of oak leaves on his head, a cruel reference to his time as an outlaw in the forests. They tied him to a wooden frame, making sure the crowd could see him clearly. Vendors sold ale and bread as if the event were a fair. By the time Wallace reached the capital, his appearance had been reduced to that of a beggar, his hair and beard shorn, his clothes replaced with rags. The final leg was the most public. Tied face up to a hurdle, a wooden sled, Wallace was dragged through London's busiest streets. The cobblestones tore at his back, leaving raw wounds. He could not turn away or shield his face. Every insult and thrown object became part of his punishment. The route passed markets, churches, and bridges packed with onlookers. The procession was designed to pass by symbols of English power and prosperity, reinforcing the authority of the crown. By the time Wallace arrived at Smithfield, he was no longer seen as a man, but as a cautionary tale. The spectacle had stripped him of his individuality, turning him into a warning for anyone contemplating defiance. Even after his death, the English authorities ensured his humiliation would continue. They paid to preserve his tar-coated head, displaying it on London Bridge as a lasting reminder of the consequences for traitors. The procession was more than a journey. It was a public demonstration of dominance. Each stage was carefully planned to break both body and spirit, setting the tone for what would come next. With the crowd primed and the city's attention fixed, Wallace was led to the heart of English authority, where the final act of this spectacle would unfold. Inside Westminster Hall, the trial unfolded as a performance for power rather than a search for truth. Wallace was brought before a panel of English judges, their seats arranged beneath the vast timber beams, the air heavy with expectation. The charges, treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, were read aloud in Latin, a language Wallace likely did not understand. No one offered translation. The ceremony of law was maintained, but its substance was hollow. The outcome had been decided long before Wallace entered the hall. The table where the judges sat stretched the length of the chamber, its surface marked by centuries of state business. English nobles filled every seat, their faces set in judgment. There were no Scottish lords present except those who had already pledged loyalty to Edward. Scribes recorded the proceedings in careful script, listing every accusation. Wallace had made war against the king, burned villages, killed English soldiers, and attacked churches. Each charge was selected to paint him as both a criminal and an enemy of God, justifying the severity of what was to come. When Wallace was finally allowed to speak, he answered in his native Scots. He explained that he had never sworn allegiance to Edward and could not be guilty of treason against a king who had never been his sovereign. The judges showed no interest in his defense. Their silence and quick glances made it clear that the trial was a formality, a legal mechanism to legitimize what had already been ordered. The charges were not debated, and no evidence was weighed. Statements from English officials, some exaggerated or unsubstantiated, were accepted without question. The entire process was documented in detail. Court clerks noted Wallace's calm demeanor and his refusal to beg for mercy. The trial records kept in the English archives reflect a careful choreography. Every step, every word, preserved to demonstrate that the proceedings had followed the law, even if justice was absent. The trial was conducted in Latin not just for tradition, but to ensure that Wallace could not defend himself effectively. This language barrier underscored the reality that he was not meant to be heard. The setting itself reinforced the message. Wallace stood beneath royal banners, surrounded by guards, physically and symbolically placed under English authority. The audience included London merchants and invited foreign guests, all present to witness the spectacle. The timing of the trial, held during the assizes, when harsh sentences were common, added to its gravity. Conviction came swiftly. The presiding judge donned the black cap and delivered the sentence in Latin. Wallace would be drawn to the place of execution, hanged, disemboweled while alive, beheaded, and quartered. Each punishment was spelled out, not for fairness, but to turn violence into official process. Wallace's reaction to the verdict was noted by officials. He remained silent, neither pleading nor resisting, his composure recorded in the court documents. The records took care to show that every legal step had been followed, though the reality was that the trial offered no chance of reprieve. The charges, the process, and the verdict all had been prepared in advance. Some judges had even signed blank verdict forms before Wallace arrived in London. By the time the trial ended, the machinery of authority had done its work. Guards led Wallace from the hall, the sentence set to be carried out without delay. The trial had not only condemned a man, but also laid the groundwork for what would follow, a punishment designed to erase both his body and his memory. What followed was not a simple execution, but a demonstration of calculated cruelty, engineered to extinguish both hope and memory through methodical suffering. The punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering was reserved for those the crown deemed the greatest threat, traitors whose deaths needed to serve as public warnings. Every stage of Wallace's ordeal was measured for effect, turning the act of killing into a tool of statecraft. The sequence began with Wallace bound to a hurdle, dragged through the crowded streets behind a horse. The rough wood tore at his back, the ropes cut into his flesh, and the crowd pressed in close enough to jeer or spit. This was not transport. It was the opening act of humiliation, meant to weaken him physically and strip away any remaining dignity. The law required traitors be drawn to execution, a term that would later also come to mean the gutting that followed. At Smithfield, the executioners used a gallows fitted with a simple noose and pulley. The drop was calculated to suffocate rather than kill instantly, denying Wallace even the mercy of a quick end. He hung just long enough to lose consciousness, but not life. The executioner watched for signs, slackening limbs, a change in breath, then cut him down while his heart still beat. The goal was to keep him aware for what came next. Pinned to the scaffold, Wallace endured the most harrowing stage. The executioner opened his abdomen with a curved blade, trained to avoid arteries that would bring a swift death. His intestines were pulled out and, according to the Chronicle of Lanercost, burned before his eyes. In an age when the soul was believed to dwell in the entrails, this was a calculated act of spiritual desecration. The crowd watched as the executioner worked methodically, prolonging the agony to reinforce the lesson. Quartering followed. Each limb was severed at the joint, the head removed and set aside for display. City records show the authorities paid to preserve Wallace's head with tar before mounting it on London Bridge. His arms and legs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, where they were fixed above gates as warnings to others. The message was clear. Defiance would be met with total obliteration, not just of life, but of identity. Yet even as the authorities tried to erase him, the reaction was not what they intended. Scottish accounts describe locals leaving flowers at the sites where his limbs were displayed, quietly honoring the man the English sought to destroy. What was meant as a deterrent became, instead, a gesture of resistance and remembrance. The spectacle, designed to terrify, produced a martyr. The cost of this ritual was carefully recorded: payments for rope, the hurdle, the executioner's extra fee, and linen for wrapping the remains. Every step was bureaucratized, the violence made routine. But the effect was not so easily managed. The elaborate cruelty, meant to reinforce royal authority, instead exposed its limits. With Wallace's body reduced to fragments, the city prepared for the next act. The crowd, drawn by the promise of spectacle, had witnessed the full machinery of punishment, an event that would linger in memory long after the scaffold was cleared. On the morning of August 23, 1305, London woke to an air of anticipation that felt more like a festival than an execution. Smithfield, usually a place of livestock and trade, became the stage for a spectacle orchestrated by the crown. Vendors set up early, hawking pies and ale to crowds that pressed in from every direction. People brought stools and baskets, children sat on shoulders, and the market's usual noise blended with the hum of expectation. The authorities had timed everything perfectly, ensuring that city dwellers and country folk alike would witness the fate of the man branded a traitor to England. This was no ordinary punishment. Notices posted in advance described Wallace as a criminal and robber, stripping him of any knightly dignity in the public eye. Street preachers worked the crowd, casting him as a villain in sermons, while enterprising sellers offered small wooden gallows as grim souvenirs. The event was designed to be both a warning and a celebration of royal authority, a deliberate transformation of justice into public theater. When Wallace finally arrived, dragged on a hurdle through the packed streets, the mood shifted. The jeers grew louder, and the crowd surged forward, eager for a closer look. Guards kept a tight cordon, but the spectacle was impossible to contain. Some onlookers hurled rotten vegetables, others crossed themselves or turned away. A few Scottish merchants stood quietly, their faces unreadable. The scaffold itself rose above the crowd, 10 feet high and surrounded by platforms for those who paid for the best view. Everything had been arranged for maximum visibility and impact. The execution unfolded as a grim performance. The executioner displayed his tools, noose, knives, and axe, each set out with deliberate ceremony. As Wallace was forced up the ladder, the crowd's noise turned to a chant, punctuated by nervous laughter and shouts. The hanging was not meant to kill quickly. The drop was just enough to choke, not break the neck. Some in the crowd cheered, others fell silent as Wallace struggled at the end of the rope. Merchants continued selling food and drink, the ordinary business of the market mingling with the extraordinary violence on display. The next stage brought a new level of horror. The executioner's assistants held Wallace steady while the incision was made. Disembowelment, rarely survived in any form, was rumored to prolong suffering, and stories of victims lingering in agony only deepened the crowd's unease. As the organs were removed, some gasped, some turned away, and a few reacted with nervous laughter. When the heart was lifted for inspection and cast into the fire, the smell of burning flesh drifted across the square, mingling with the aroma of roasting meat from the stalls. Quartering followed, each limb tied off and prepared for dispatch. The beheading was carried out with an axe, a final indignity reserved for those denied noble status. Officials quickly packed the remains for transport, ensuring the warning would reach the far corners of Scotland. Records show that the city paid extra for the cleanup and for guards to prevent onlookers from collecting relics, yet some still tried to gather scraps of straw or bloodied earth. The authorities intended to erase Wallace's legacy, but the very excess of the spectacle inspired pockets of sympathy and defiance. Some witnesses left early, shaken by what they had seen, while others quietly marked the places where his remains were displayed. As the crowd thinned and the market resumed its routine, the details of Wallace's ordeal began to spread. Accounts of his endurance, the executioner's methods, and the reactions of those who watched. These stories, recorded and retold, would shape how the event was remembered, both as a display of royal power and as a moment that revealed the extremes of human suffering. Behind the spectacle at Smithfield stood a grimly methodical process, the science of suffering. The executioner's role was not simply to end a life, but to manage pain with chilling precision. In Wallace's case, every stage of the execution was planned to maximize agony and to keep him conscious for as long as possible. This was a craft honed over generations, its techniques passed down in secrecy, with each executioner expected to know exactly how far the human body could be pushed before it broke. The sequence began with hanging, but not the swift drop that would snap the neck. Instead, the rope was measured and placed to induce strangulation. Wallace's feet barely touched the scaffold, forcing him to kick and twist as he fought for breath. The crowd watched as his face darkened and his body convulsed, the executioner carefully monitoring his pulse and pupils. The goal was not death, but a state just short of it, enough to ensure that Wallace would remain aware for what was to follow. Disembowelment was the next stage, and it demanded a particular kind of expertise. The executioner's knife entered below the ribcage, angled to avoid major arteries. Organs were removed in a practiced order, each step intended to prolong life and pain. Witnesses described Wallace's eyes following the blade, his hands straining against the restraints even as consciousness flickered. The executioner held each organ aloft before casting it into the fire, making certain the crowd saw and understood the fate that awaited traitors. The act was not just physical destruction. It was meant to strip away dignity and humanity in front of thousands. Quartering required both strength and anatomical knowledge. Ropes were tied to Wallace's limbs and attached to horses, but before the final pull, the executioner made cuts at the joints to ensure the limbs would separate cleanly. The authorities wanted the victim alive and aware for as much of the process as possible, demanding visible proof that the punishment was witnessed by its subject. The process was not rushed. Each step was deliberate, paced to draw out the ordeal and heighten its psychological impact on everyone present. The executioners worked with a kind of clinical detachment, pausing to sharpen blades and clean their tools between each phase. One assistant kept a close eye on Wallace's condition, signaling when to proceed or when to pause to keep him conscious. The event unfolded in carefully timed stages, with brief pauses that allowed the tension in the crowd to build. Officials mingled with spectators, explaining the legal reasoning behind each act and reinforcing the authority of the crown. Medical understanding of the era, though limited, played a role in these methods. Executioners knew that cutting at joints reduced immediate blood loss and that the body could survive for several minutes after severe trauma. The boiling of limbs in tar was not only for preservation, but also ensured that no sensation remained in the remains. The entire process was documented by clerks, who recorded each stage as evidence that the sentence had been carried out to the letter. Yet the precision of the execution had an unintended effect. Some witnesses, instead of feeling only fear, began to talk of Wallace's endurance, how he remained aware through pain that should have ended any ordinary life. Rumors spread about his suffering, and questions were whispered about the justice of such cruelty. The authorities had intended to send a message, but the sheer detail of the punishment left a mark that could not be easily controlled. As the execution ended and the crowd dispersed, the authorities began the next phase of their plan. The remains of Wallace were not simply disposed of, they were prepared for a new purpose, one that would carry the message of his fate far beyond the scaffold at Smithfield. In the hours after Wallace's execution, the English authorities set in motion a campaign of intimidation that reached far beyond the scaffold at Smithfield. His head, coated in boiling tar to withstand the elements, was mounted on a spike atop London Bridge, the city's busiest crossing. Anyone arriving in or leaving London by foot, cart, or boat passed beneath this unmistakable warning. Defiance would be met with public obliteration. The head's placement was no accident. City records confirm that the bridge's central arch was chosen for maximum visibility, ensuring merchants, travelers, and diplomats all carried away the sight and the story of what happened to those who challenged the English crown. The rest of Wallace's remains were divided and dispatched north. Each limb traveled under guard, packed in salted cloth, to cities with deep political significance. Newcastle received an arm, Berwick another. Both towns marked the borderlands where English control was most bitterly contested. His legs went to Stirling and Perth, sites tied to Wallace's greatest victories and Scotland's royal past. The English administration documented every step, issuing sealed orders for the mounting and display of each piece. In Newcastle, the limb was fixed above the main gate, a silent sentinel watching over the road to Scotland. In Stirling, the display overlooked the approach to the old battlefield, forcing townspeople to pass beneath the remains on their way to market. Perth's officials, under threat of penalty, maintained the grisly exhibit through the winter, posting guards to prevent tampering. These displays were not arbitrary acts of cruelty. They formed a deliberate network of warnings, each location chosen for its symbolic weight. The authorities intended every fragment of Wallace's body to serve as a physical embodiment of English dominance, a daily reminder that rebellion would be crushed and its memory scattered. The mounting of limbs in public spaces, gatehouses, market roads, and bridges turned the landscape itself into a tool of psychological warfare. The message was clear. The reach of English power extended into every corner of Scotland. Yet the effort to control the narrative met with complications. Local reactions did not always follow the script. In Stirling, townspeople left small tokens or flowers beneath the display, gestures that English guards tried to stamp out. In Perth, a priest was reprimanded for blessing those who crossed themselves as they passed the severed limb. The very presence of these remains, intended to suppress resistance, sometimes gave communities a place to gather and mourn, transforming sites of warning into quiet memorials. The campaign's scale revealed its own limits. Maintaining distant displays required constant vigilance and resources. Over time, the preserved limbs shrank and decayed, losing their intended shock value. Complaints from local officials about the smell and the burden of guard duty appeared in city records. Still, the authorities pressed on, convinced that relentless reminders would finally break Scottish resolve. Instead, the aftermath of Wallace's execution became a kind of message in reverse. The attempt to erase his influence from the landscape only made his absence more visible. Scots who passed beneath the remnants were forced to confront not just the cost of resistance, but the lengths to which the English would go to enforce submission. What was meant to end a movement instead left a mark that was impossible to ignore, setting the stage for consequences no one in Edward's administration fully anticipated. Edward I believed that by executing William Wallace in the most public and brutal way possible, he would stamp out the last embers of Scottish resistance. Instead, the aftermath revealed a profound miscalculation. The plan to use Wallace's body as a warning, his head displayed on London Bridge, his limbs sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, did not instill fear as intended. Instead, these sites became points of silent defiance. The English authorities had hoped to erase Wallace's influence, but their actions only deepened his hold on the Scottish imagination. Robert the Bruce's response demonstrated the unintended consequences of Edward's strategy. Before Wallace's death, Bruce had wavered between rebellion and uneasy cooperation with the English crown. The execution marked a turning point. Chroniclers noted Bruce's resolve hardening in the months that followed. By early 1306, Bruce began preparing for open rebellion, drawing inspiration from Wallace's fate. Whether or not stories of Bruce carrying a relic of Wallace are true, it is clear that Wallace's death became a personal and political catalyst for Bruce and his followers. The brutality at Smithfield changed the way Scots fought. The knowledge that capture meant torture and public humiliation left little room for surrender. At Loudon Hill in 1307, Bruce's men fought with a new ferocity, refusing to grant quarter to English knights, a stark departure from earlier customs of ransom and exchange. English reports from the years after Wallace's death describe Scottish fighters as more desperate and determined, shaped by the memory of what had happened to their leader. Edward's campaign of propaganda also failed to control the narrative. The English intended the display of Wallace's remains to deter would-be rebels, but instead, rumors and legends grew around each site. In Newcastle, locals whispered that the limb above the gate brought misfortune to English patrols. In Stirling and Perth, the very presence of Wallace's remains kept his name alive in the daily lives of townspeople. The English administration found it increasingly difficult to suppress these stories or prevent gatherings, despite official prohibitions. The logistical burden of maintaining these grisly displays soon became apparent. Treasury records from 1306 and 1307 show repeated payments for tar, iron spikes, and guards to keep the remains visible and protected from tampering. Over time, the cost and effort of this campaign began to outweigh its value, and some sites quietly abandoned the displays rather than continue the upkeep. The psychological effect of Wallace's execution reached far beyond the immediate aftermath. Military recruitment in Scotland surged, with young men claiming allegiance to Wallace's cause. Veterans from his campaigns became sought-after leaders, and tavern songs in Edinburgh and beyond turned Wallace into a larger-than-life figure. The details of his death, passed down in stories, ballads, and whispered accounts, became warnings not against rebellion, but against submission. The English had tried to extinguish a symbol, but in doing so, they ensured its survival. Edward I's attempt to erase Wallace from history by scattering his remains and documenting every stage of his punishment had the opposite result. The records, the sites, and the stories all contributed to a memory that proved impossible to suppress. Rather than ending a movement, the king's actions created a foundation for something enduring. This legacy would not fade with the passing of years, but instead would shape how generations understood the struggle for Scottish identity. The transformation of William Wallace from condemned rebel to enduring national symbol began not with his victories in battle, but with the spectacle of his death. The English authorities had intended to erase him, but the elaborate punishment and public display of his remains achieved the opposite. The details of his execution, drawn from Exchequer rolls, Scottish chronicles, and English records, circulated quickly, their precision lending weight to the story that followed. The state's attempt at total destruction became the raw material for a legend that would outlast every political calculation. Stories took root almost at once. Accounts spread through towns and villages, claiming that Wallace's tarred head on London Bridge sometimes appeared to watch passing boats, or that his quartered limbs bled anew on the anniversary of his death. These tales, though unverifiable, signaled a shift. The brutality meant to frighten the population instead fed a process of myth-making. The suffering Wallace endured became a kind of proof for later generations, not just of his resistance, but of the cruelty of those who sought to destroy him. By the 15th century, the legend had taken on a life of its own. Blind Harry's epic poem, The Wallace, gathered scattered stories and rumors, weaving them into a narrative that positioned Wallace as Scotland's great martyr. The poem blurred fact and invention, describing acts of vengeance and heroism that extended far beyond the historical record. Yet it was precisely this mixture that gave the myth its staying power. The poem's influence shaped how Scots remembered Wallace, embedding him in the national consciousness as a figure who chose suffering over surrender. Physical reminders of the execution became relics. People claimed fragments of the Smithfield scaffold, or preserved earth stained with Wallace's blood, believing these objects held protective power. The very tools of his humiliation, the ropes, the chains, the tar, became symbols of endurance. For centuries, Scottish fighters carried tokens said to be linked to Wallace into battle, invoking his name in moments of crisis. The official records, intended to document the triumph of English justice, instead preserved the details that would fuel the legend. Payments for tar, iron spikes, and the transport of limbs appear in city and royal accounts, their bureaucratic language unable to conceal the violence they described. These records became evidence not of control, but of excess, proof that the punishment had gone beyond what was necessary, and in doing so, had crossed into the territory of martyrdom. Wallace's story resurfaced in moments of national crisis. During the Reformation and the Jacobite uprisings, his name was invoked as a symbol of resistance to foreign rule. Monuments rose in his honor, and annual commemorations drew crowds who saw in his suffering a reflection of their own struggles. In the modern era, Wallace's execution remains a touchstone in Scottish identity, taught in schools and marked by ceremonies at the National Wallace Monument. The details of his death, painstakingly recorded, retold, and reinterpreted, still shape how Scots understand their past. The myth of Wallace does not erase the man, but it does transform him. The historical figure disappears beneath the weight of collective memory, replaced by a symbol that can be adapted to fit the needs of each generation. The violence meant to silence him instead gave rise to a story that persists, not as a simple tale of defeat, but as a reminder of how suffering and endurance can become the foundation for something lasting. In the end, the execution at Smithfield did not close the book on Scottish resistance. It opened a new chapter, one in which Wallace's death became the rallying point for a nation. The spectacle designed to destroy a cause instead gave it renewed strength, ensuring that the story of Wallace would continue to shape Scotland's sense of itself long after the violence had faded from living memory. Edward I's campaign of calculated violence was meant to extinguish the idea of Scottish resistance. Instead, the execution of Wallace, meticulously recorded in the wardrobe accounts, memoranda roll, and pipe roll, ensured every detail would endure. These records, intended as proof of royal authority, became the foundation for Wallace's legend. History shows that extreme punishment can strengthen the very resolve it aims to crush. The public spectacle, the scattered remains, and the bureaucratic precision of the records did not erase Wallace. They made his story inescapable. The horror intended to silence him instead preserved his defiance for generations. Centuries later, it is not the brutality that endures, but the principle for which Wallace died.